I remember being in middle school here in America for the very first time. You see, I'm an Army kid. I'm an Army brat. I grew up in South Korea. A big chunk of my childhood was spent over there. And school there was very different than school in America. For one thing, I was surrounded by children from all over the world. Every possible shade you could imagine. From really, really dark skin all the way to kids with very little melanin. We were just an array. And so I never felt like I stuck out there. We were just all kids hanging out. But in the 80s, we moved from South Korea to Lawton, Oklahoma. My father was stationed at Fort Sill. And there was a school that was where most of the Army kids went. And I went there, obviously. Well, actually, it's not exactly true. There was another school that was on the base for Army kids. But if your parents lived off the base and you lived in this one particular area, then you went to the school. So I guess that's a better way to say it. And when I went to that school, it was the very first time I was in a mostly homogenous situation. Basically, everybody else was white except for me in my classes. And partly this was a problem because I was in honors classes. And for some reason, in this particular school in in Lawton, Oklahoma, I was the only black kid in any of the honors classes. Which again, it didn't faze me. It was a little weird to be surrounded by people who were all like one color. But other than that, it wasn't that big a deal. Until we started studying American history. And we got to that point in the textbook where for the very first time I was aware of being a black kid, and they were talking about slaves. And it was the first time I could feel people kind of looking over at me. Like somehow they were talking about me. And the way that we dealt with it, it just seemed like it went by really, really fast and got kind of swept under the rug a little bit, and they didn't really want to talk about it. There wasn't much in there. You would think that it really wasn't a thing other than like the 2 paragraphs we had to read about it. And the teachers didn't go into it very much, and we didn't really hear about it again until the Civil War, and then it was like an afterthought, and we spent a lot of time talking about the Civil War, but not necessarily what the underlying reason was. And of course, in Lawton, Oklahoma in the 80s, mostly they talked about states' rights. They did not say much about the fact that it was about enslaved people. But that's not the biggest thing. The thing that was weird about it was, like, somehow I felt like it was on me to say something about it. I didn't, because no one asked me to say anything about it, and it just felt like everyone was uncomfortable, because somehow this was something about me. And I wish with all my heart that they had talked about the whole thing with the Civil War differently. And they talked about enslavement differently. I would have really liked that as a kid. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what that would have sounded like. The story of my ancestors. What would that have been like? Because you see, for the most part, the story of my ancestors isn't told from the point of view of my ancestors. It's told from the point of view of the people who enslaved my ancestors. And so when they talk about slaves, the idea is somehow, the thing is that I am descendant of people who were slaves. And I wish that it had been turned around and spoken of differently. Now, it's not that they tried to say, oh, they were slaves, they never accomplished anything. No. I learned about famous people who were black. And in fact, the one I remember, Harriet Tubman didn't even really come up much. But the one thing that got touted as the big achievement, right, was George Washington Carver. Does anyone remember that name, George Washington Carver? When I was in school, they told us that George Washington Carver created peanut butter. That was his claim to fame, peanut butter. So that's like the one fact I took out of those classes. That's like I could take a link to, right? But here's the thing that's funny about that. That's not true. That is a myth. Peanut butter existed prior to George Washington Carver. He did not invent peanut butter. All right? So the one thing I learned as a real thing wasn't a real thing. No, George Washington Carver was a scientist, and a pretty brilliant one. He figured out how to feed people with peanuts. He figured out all these different ways to feed people because there was a famine. People were hungry. And he figured out how to feed people cheaply and well with peanuts. Well, that would have been a cooler thing to learn than he created peanut butter, but that is what I was taught. And just, on the other end of this, there weren't a lot of women in my history book either. And the one thing that I remember that I took away from the whole American Revolution about women was that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. And that's not true either. As far as historians can tell, Betsy Ross, she did not design that flag. And she was a seamstress. She might have sewn it. And if you sort of chase that backwards, you find out that one of her daughters made this claim. But there is no... or one of her great-granddaughters, something like that, but there is no evidence that happened. So the only woman I remember really talking about sewing a flag, not true as far as we can tell. And then the thing about learning about black people, not true as far as we can tell. So how would I have wanted that thing to be taught, talking about slavery? Well, the first thing I would have liked is if they had changed the terminology. You see, my ancestors were enslaved. What that means is somebody removed them from their situation and tried to force them to be a thing. And so always when I talk about my ancestors, I don't say slave, because a slave is something you are, and enslaved is something somebody did to you. And you cannot be enslaved unless there are enslavers. A slave suggests that it's a one kind of person thing. I'm a slave. Enslaved, you cannot be enslaved unless somebody is doing that to you. If they talked about that like that in my classrooms, it would not have been all of these people looking at me like, your family were slaves. Instead, it would have been like, yikes, my family enslaved people, which is a completely different thing. As opposed to looking at me and going, how do you feel about that? It's looking at me and going, we are so sorry. Not that they would have had to apologize or anything like that, but it wasn't me. I'm not the one who did that. My ancestors didn't do that. I'm not the one who needs to be apologizing for anything. Just saying. Anyway, I would have liked that to be the basis of it. But then, if you do that, then you have to deal with what happened. For 3 centuries, 300 years, the Western world went to West Africa and removed the strongest and the most capable men and women, and a whole lot of those children simply just stole them. It was the rape of intelligence and youth and vigor and hope for an entire continent of people as those stories trickled through the world. It was a disastrous thing to do, to re-traumatize people for 300 years. But even so, even having done that, what about the people they took? Imagine that you have a population of people. You have smart people, you have sad people, you have strong people, you have weak people. You have smart people, you have dumb people. We know there are dumb people. And you take all of these people and you put them in the pens on the Côte d'Ivoire, the coast of Africa, the Ivory Coast. Some of them are not going to make it. They're going to die. The sickest, the weakest, the ones who despair, the people who can't deal, gone. You take what's left of them and you put them on a ship without explaining what's going on or where they're doing, chain them down, send them off across the ocean. Some of those people are going to die. They're weak and they're sick and they're sad. The people who can't find a reason to live. The people who aren't strong enough. The people who aren't creative enough to go into their minds and create worlds to live in safely. Those people who can't do that aren't going to survive this. Then you get to the other side. What have you got left? You have got the strongest, most creative, survival, people who were determined to survive, and undoubtedly the angriest people on the planet. And that is who they tried to enslave. These are not weak, sad, distraught people. These are strong, determined people. And if you look at that group of people like that, then some things make perfect sense. Like, why, if they were slaves and they were downtrodden, did you have so many people running away? Because these people were determined to survive and determined to be free. They were going to get through it, and they passed that down. They were not content to be slaves. Had they been content to be enslaved, you wouldn't have had things like the Fugitive Slave Act, which is like gather them up and bring them back. And even you gathered them up and brought them back, people ran away time and time and time again. They were never willing to be that way. They were never willing to be enslaved. What they wanted was the right to be free and to be looked at as human beings. No matter how many laws got passed, they're not allowed to read and write. They're not allowed to do this. They're not allowed to do that. They didn't ever stop trying to find freedom. To the point where they would run into the swamps. They're like the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina. Whole communities of African Americans living in the swamps because the enslavers, the white people, were too afraid to go in there and get them out. Those are my ancestors, the survivors, the strongest, the most cunning, the creative. That's who I am descended of. And I really would have liked to have it taught that way when I was in school. Because then Sojourner Truth makes sense, and Harriet Tubman makes sense, and Frederick Douglass makes sense. John Brown makes sense. All the people who fought and strove and died so that I could be here today, free to live my life as best I can. That's what it's like when you tell the history of America through the ancestors' eyes. My ancestors.